is David Coon. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is David Coon, and I live in Huntington in the Mount Vernon district. In 1976, the board authorized a neighborhood conservation plan for Huntington, and one of the primary objectives of this plan was to alleviate tidal flooding in Huntington from the Potomac River. At that time, there were 76 homes in Huntington that were in the floodplain, but today there's 180 homes in the floodplain in Huntington. In 1982, there was a study of flooding in Huntington, but nothing was done. And then in June of 2006, a devastating flood flooded 160 homes in Huntington, and about a third of those homes had flooding in the first floor, but all 160 had floodwaters completely in the basement. In response, the county set up a desperately needed 24/7 emergency operations center in the neighborhood, costing $3 to $5 million for the response. Damages totaled at least $10 million to the residents. The board and Congressman Moran gratefully helped secure funding for a study from the Army Corps of Engineers to determine the cause of flooding in Huntington. And basically, the Corps found that the flooding has become severe in Huntington because of 5 to 6 feet of sediment that has accumulated in Huntington from decades of development in the Cameron Run watershed, coupled with Route 1 interchange improvements as part of the Wilson Bridge project and other floodplain development such as the Huntington Metro Station. In April of 2009, the Army Corps recommended a levee as the only viable solution to the flooding in Huntington. And then in June of 2009, the Huntington Community Association submitted a request to the board to see that a levee could be built. But then in September of 2011, another severe flood hit our community, flooding 161 homes in the basements. Again, the county was great. We're grateful that they provided a 24/7 emergency response. And we don't know the cost of the 2011 response, but if we assume that it's the same as 2006, that brings the total cost that the county has paid in emergency response anywhere between $6 and $10 million, and there's been over $20 million in property damage to the homes in Huntington. For the past 3 weeks, we asked people to sign a petition supporting flood protection for Huntington, and we've received over 1,300 signatures from people who support flood protection for Huntington, including almost 1,200 Fairfax County residents in those signatures. Thanks for your time. I know that you, Madam Chair, and our supervisors, Supervisor Highland, support a levee for Huntington, and we're grateful for that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, David. Alan Ruof, representing the Huntington Community Association. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Alan Ruof from Huntington Community Association. When our community was built in the 1940s, Cameron Run already was there. So why does Huntington deserve protection? The answer is that the behavior of Cameron Run has changed, drastically changed, over time. In the 1960s, when the Beltway was built, Cameron Run at Huntington was a meandering stream with wetlands, but it was in the way. So the solution was to bring in fill and straighten and narrow the channel and move it much closer to our neighborhood. By 1969, that would have violated federal environmental law, but in the early 60s, it could happen, and it did. The 2000 Army Corps study concluded that the severe flooding in Huntington is man-made. Most of the 42-square-mile Cameron Run watershed is inside the Beltway. It includes the mixing bowl and where 495 and Route 66 meet. From 1965 to 1999, development in that watershed deposited 5 to 6 feet of silt at Huntington, and that caused an extra 2 feet of floodwater in 2006. The Route 1 interchange improvements increased flooding by another foot or so. Development of the floodplain, including Metro Rail, added about another half foot. In 2009, the Corps identified the best way to protect our community. They looked at elevating homes and filling in basements and buying out properties, but they said a levee is a better choice. It would be a half mile long, 10 to 15 feet above the existing ground, 10 feet wide at the crest, and include a pumping station. The levee is 99% certain to protect homes during a 100-year flood and 97% certain to protect them in a 500-year flood. The most extreme prediction of sea level rise from climate change says there would be an additional 1/3 of a foot of water at Huntington. But since the levee would be 3 to 4 feet above the 100-year flood elevation, that's not a concern. With the levee, homes would be removed from the floodplain, so flood insurance would drop from $2,000 or $3,000 a year to about $400. The total project is now estimated to be about $30 million. We're asked to, just as we did in 2009, to fund the construction of a levee to protect Huntington, and to begin by having the Corps complete the final design of it at a cost of about $3 million. The Corps did an analysis and found that costs exceed benefits, which means the Corps will not fund the levee. One reason is that the Corps focuses on how much damage will be avoided, and property values aren't very high in Huntington. It's a catch-62, because you can't justify preventing flooding because the risk of flooding reduces property values, and that makes the cost-benefit ratio unappealing. So the Corps analysis doesn't tell the whole story. First, interest rates are at an historical low. The county just borrowed at a rate of 2.43%. The Corps assumed a rate of 4 5/8%, so the dollar gap is less than their calculation. Second, the Corps looks at hypotheticals, but it's hard to ignore the actuals. $20 million of damage to our neighborhood in the past 5 years, $6 to $10 million in emergency services. Third, the Corps doesn't consider how the tax base and business activity erode if our area becomes blighted versus how property values would increase with protection. Or that with BRAC, you need affordable housing, but the flooding devalues what Huntington has to offer. Or that we're the gateway to Richmond Highway. Flooding and improving the corridor don't go together. The Corps doesn't consider public health and safety or the value of preserving a community or the jobs that would be created to design, build, and maintain a levee. If a levee is built, our community could consider, within the framework of our conservation plan, what may be the highest and best use of the area north of Huntington Avenue, which is high-density, transit-oriented development. If owners choose to sell, new buildings to have their lowest entry points well above the 100-year flood elevation. But if no levee is built, developers could only buy out properties to increase density outside of the floodplain. That's it. The floodplain will be green space. Most importantly, the Corps doesn't look beyond Huntington. There's a direct and irrefutable cause and effect relationship between the increased severity of flooding in Huntington and decades of development in Cameron Run and building the Beltway and improving the Route 1 interchange and putting Metro Rail in the floodplain. Those changes have produced immense advantages for the county. What kind of an analysis concludes that the cost of providing flood protection cannot be supported because of insufficient benefits? Enough revenue has been created from these changes to pay for a levee over and over and over. I truly appreciate your time and attention, and I hope you'll find it in our hearts to help us. The flooding in Huntington is not like other natural disasters. It's predictable. It's preventable. It's wrong to have approved development and transportation improvements for decades that confer such an advantage upon the county and to then reject protection for the community that must bear the burden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And our next speaker is Pietra. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Pietra, and I live in Huntington, too. You've heard why we flood and why protecting us makes sense. But there's another dimension that I ask you to consider. The repeated flooding in our neighborhood has really taken a toll on people, both financially and emotionally. After 2 floods in just 5 years, people who live in Huntington are wiped out. Many didn't have flood insurance in 2006 because the flood went beyond what the floodplain boundaries were at that time. Even if you had flood insurance, there's a lot it doesn't cover, and homeowners insurance usually doesn't cover flooding. People moved out for weeks or months while they repaired their homes. It's hard to fix your property and still go to work, and the exposure to flood water could be making you sick. First, you have to take everything out of your house and throw it away because the flood water is contaminated with sewage. Everything is wet and dirty and heavy, and it smells. You have to work fast before the mold grows in your house, and then you have to disinfect every single surface that the floodwater touched. You have to replace your furnace, your air conditioner, your water heater, washer, dryer. You have to get several inspections before your gas and electric can be turned back on. So you're doing all this cleanup with no electricity, meaning you have no air conditioning, no fan blowing on you, no hot water to take a shower, and you can't wash your clothes. You can't cook, and you don't have a refrigerator, and chances are good that your car was flooded too. You also lose things you can't replace. In 2006, no one had any idea that the flood was coming, so when the basements were flooded, many residents lost home offices or rec rooms, or just that extra bit of space that makes our small homes comfortable. But we also lost family photos, wedding albums, videotapes, things that you really wanted to pass on to your children, and now they're all gone. And that's just people who had their basements flooded. Can you imagine what it's like when your first floor goes too? And every time it rains for more than one day, your heart's in your throat. You have nightmares about water and rain. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, but please come spend an afternoon where I live and talk to a few people, and you'll find out that I am not. Recently, 2 firefighters were recognized by the county for a rescue in the 2011 flood. Their actions were heroic, and we thank them. 2 women needed help. The floodwaters rose so quickly that both of them and one firefighter were swept off their feet. They hung onto a street sign, and the other firefighter pulled them to safety. One woman was 8 months pregnant, and the other was holding a 2-week-old baby. That was on Arlington Terrace. On Fenwick Drive, another woman who was 8 months pregnant was lifted by her husband and 4 others from her own backyard up to an adjoining street that was on higher ground. Then she and her husband walked a mile to a friend's house for shelter. The situation sent her into labor, and her baby was born 1 month premature. These are just 2 flood stories. Every resident of the 160 affected homes has a story to tell. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about this matter of such importance to our community. We know the levy is expensive, and we know our property values aren't as high as in other areas of the county, but we love our neighborhood. We truly are a community. We look out for each other, and we need your help. Please pay for a levy to protect our homes. Our future is in your hands.
Thank you, Pietra. And you are not exaggerating. I was out there along with Supervisor Highland, and it was really a pretty awful situation, and people were very disheartened because it was not the first time, that they had to deal with that. So anyway, I appreciate your testimony, appreciate your coming out. I'm assuming that you're testifying especially in favor of the stormwater penny, the entire penny, not a fraction of, so that there's adequate funding for the study to be done. Is that sort of the bottom line here?
That would be excellent. We know that we need a levy. We leave the solution to you.
Okay.
To your judgment.
All right. Thank you all very much again. Appreciate your coming out.
Thank you.
Hang in. Thanks.
Our next speakers